The final topic we're going to go over for factoring is solving quadratic equations by factoring, and you can practice this in section 6.6 of your Hawks homework. Okay, but before we actually give some examples, I just kind of want to talk to you about what it means to solve by factoring. And basically, if you have something like A times B equal to 0, okay, you can assume that either A or B has to be 0 because one of them has to be 0 in order for you to multiply and get 0 as an answer. So if A were 2 and B were 0, we would have 2 times 0 equals 0. Okay, so kind of keep that in mind. And what we're going to be looking at is we're going to be looking at our factors like we were finding in the previous examples, but now they're going to be equal to 0, and we're going to have to solve for x. So what we're going to end up doing is taking each one of our factors, this is kind of like a, and we're going to take that and we're going to set it equal to 0. And we're going to do the exact same thing to the x minus 3. I'm going to set it equal to 0. Then what we're going to do is solve each one of these equations. So we're going to get that x equals a negative 2. There's one possible answer. Or we're going to add 3 on the second equation and x would equal 3, and there's our second answer. For the most part, quadratic equations will give you 2 distinct answers, but on occasion you can have ones that will only give you one answer. So here's some examples of solving quadratics by factoring. Okay, so here's our first example. We've got 2x squared minus 2x minus 60 equal to 0. When you're going to solve something by factoring, it's important that it's always equal to 0. So in this particular problem, that's our case. Now what we need to do is notice that if you look at the coefficients of each of the terms here, they're all divisible by 2. So what we can do to start this problem and make it just a little bit easier is go ahead and divide out a 2 from each one. And anytime you're looking at a problem and it's got a variable in front of that x squared, you want to see if you can get rid of that first, because that'll make the factoring a whole lot easier. So we're going to have x squared minus 1x minus 30 equals to 0. Okay, so now all we need to do is factor just like we've learned how to do in our previous videos. We're going to do our 2 parentheses. We've got x and x. Since this back sign is negative, we know that they're going to be opposite signs. Now remember, we need two numbers that multiply to 30, and they need to subtract to 1. And that's going to be 5 and 6. Because this is a negative 1x, that means our 6 is going to be our negative number. Okay, and remember it's equal to 0. So that's not the end of this problem. We still got to do one more step, and we got to split this up. We have to say x plus 5 is equal to 0, and x minus 6 is equal to 0. So we're going to subtract 5 from our first equation and get x equals negative 5, and we're going to add the 6 to our second equation and get x equals 6. And so our two answers would be negative 5 and 6. So for our second example, we have x squared minus 9x plus 20. Again, it's equal to 0, so we're all set up to work this problem. We're going to go ahead and start factoring since there's no number in front of our x squared and there's nothing in common. So we're going to do our 2 parentheses. We've got our x leading. Notice our back sign is positive, so that means they're going to be the same sign, and our middle sign is negative, so they're both going to be negative. We need two numbers that are going to multiply to 20. And they need to add to 9. Okay, and that's going to be 5 and 4. So it doesn't matter which one goes where since they're both signs are negative. Still equal to 0. Now we split it. X minus 5 equals 0, and x minus 4 equals 0. We're going to add 5 to both sides here, and x equals 5. We're going to add 4 to both sides here, and x equals 4. So our two answers are 5 and 4. So for our third example, we have x squared plus 5x plus 1 equals negative 3. You'll notice in this example it's not equal to 0, so the first thing we have to do before we can start factoring is we've got to take that negative 3 and move it over to the other side. So we're going to add 3 to both sides. So that's going to give us x squared plus 5x plus 4 equal to 0. Now we can start our factoring. We've got x and x. The back sign is positive and the middle sign is positive, so that means both our signs will be plus. We need two numbers that multiply to 4, and they need to add to 5, and so that's going to be 4 and 1 equal to 0. Okay? Now we're going to take each parentheses. X plus 4 is equal to 0, so we're going to subtract 4 from both sides, and x equals negative 4. We're going to do the same thing with our second parentheses. X plus 1 equals 0. Subtract 1 from both sides, and x equals negative 1. So our two answers are negative 4 and negative 1. Okay, so for our last example, we have 5x squared equals a negative 30x. So what we're going to do is we're going to get our 0 by adding that 30x to both sides. So let's go ahead and add 30x and add 30x. Notice you can't actually add 5x squared and 30x because they are not like terms. So over here on the left, we're going to have 5x squared plus 30x equal to 0. Now, this is a little different from the last three examples I've given you because this one doesn't have that constant term on the end. And if you'll notice that the two terms you do have not only have a 5 in common, but they also have an x in common. So we're actually going to pull out the greatest common factor, which is 5x, which will leave us x plus 6 equal to 0. Now, the same way we did the parentheses, you're going to do the exact same thing here. 5x is one of your factors, and you're going to place that equal to 0. And x plus 6 is your other, equal to 0. So here we're going to divide by 5, and x equals 0, so there's one answer. Here we'll subtract 6, and x equals negative 6, and there's our second answer. Okay. If you have any questions about Chapter 6 or factoring, please let me know.